Hi, I'm Luminaria Star, and this is a Metaphysician's Journal. Hi, I know it's been a while since I've made a video, but today I am going to make up for it with a celebration of the life of one of our very favorites in the New Age community, Edgar Cayce. It's Edgar Cayce's birthday today. He was an American mystic who allegedly possessed the ability to answer questions on subjects as varied as healing, reincarnation, wars, Atlantis, and future events, all while in a trance. These answers came to be known as life readings of the entity, and were usually delivered to individuals while Cayce was hypnotized. This ability gave him the nickname the Sleeping Prophet. Born on March 18, 1877, near the town of Beverly, south of Hopkinsville, Kentucky, he was one of 6 children in a farm family. He didn't have much education, only getting as far as the 9th grade. And he wasn't very successful as a student until he fell asleep on one of his textbooks. And the very next day he knew everything in the book. He started making a regular practice of this and soon excelled at all of his schoolwork. In the 8th grade he began to manifest the psychic abilities he would later become famous for. He could see the auras around people, speak to angels, and hear voices of departed relatives. In his early years, he agonized over whether these psychic abilities were spiritually delivered from the highest sources. He was an extremely devout Christian all of his life, attended church regularly, and every year read the Bible completely through. Once he'd left school, he started out with a job selling insurance with his father, but shortly after, he wound up losing his voice to laryngitis. Unable to work, he lived at home with his parents for almost a year. He then decided to take up the trade of photography, an occupation that would exert less strain on his voice. He began an apprenticeship at the photography studio of W.R. Bowles in Hopkinsville, and eventually became quite talented in this trade. In 1901, a traveling stage hypnotist and entertainer named Hart was performing at the Hopkinsville Opera House. Hart heard about Cayce's condition and offered to attempt a cure. Cayce accepted his offer, and the experiment took place on stage in front of a full audience. Cayce's voice allegedly returned while in a hypnotic trance, but then disappeared again upon awakening. Hart tried a post-hypnotic suggestion that the voice would continue to function after the trance, but this proved unsuccessful. Since Hart was traveling a circuit, he had obligations to continue on to other cities, so he couldn't continue his hypnotic treatment of Cayce. Al Lane, a local hypnotist, offered to help Cayce in restoring his voice. Lane suggested that Cayce describe the nature of his condition and cure while in a hypnotic trance, and Cayce described his own ailment from a first-person plural point of view, using we instead of the singular I. In later sessions, when Cayce read for other people, he would indicate that the connection was made to the entity of the person that was requesting the reading by saying, "We have the body." According to the reading for the entity of Cayce, his voice loss was due to psychological paralysis and could be corrected by increasing the blood flow to the voice box. The suggestion was made that the blood flow be increased, and Cayce's face, chest, and throat turned bright red as they became flushed with blood. 20 minutes later, Cayce, still in a trance, declared the treatment over. Upon awakening, his voice remained normal. Relapses did occur, but they were successfully dealt with in the same way, and eventually the cure was declared permanent. Lane had read of similar hypnotic cures by followers of Franz Mesmer, and was keen to explore the limits of the healing knowledge involved with the trance voice. He asked Cayce to describe his own ailments, and found the results both accurate and effective. Lane suggested that Cayce offer his trance healing to the public, and Cayce was reluctant at first, but agreed that as long as the readings would be offered for free, he would go along with it. Reports appeared in the newspapers, and before long they were flooded with letters. Cayce discovered that he could work just as effectively using only a letter from the individual as with the person being present in the room. Given only the person's name and location, Cayce could diagnose the physical and mental conditions of what he termed the entity, and then provide a remedy. He soon became famous, and people from around the world sought his advice. As his fame grew, he found that this was taking up more and more of his time, so he asked for donations to support himself and his family. But times were hard, and the funds that came were not sufficient. He came up with an idea for a card game named Pit that was based on commodities trading, and the game is still available today. He continued with his visionary and healing work, and gradually his family became involved, eventually replacing Lane as his trance guides. A secretary named Gladys Davis was hired to take transcriptions of the sessions. Various businessmen tried to take advantage of Cayce's abilities, but after a brief stint at trying to accommodate them, he refused to go along with their schemes in spite of his need for income. The results for readings devoted to gambling or speculations were disappointing, and he felt that this was a sign that his efforts should be devoted to healing and higher pursuits. A student of metaphysics persuaded him to give readings on more theoretical and philosophical subjects, and Cayce consented to these, feeling that this was within his ethics. It was during these sessions that he began to talk about reincarnation and the validity of astrology, and stated clearly that Atlantis did indeed exist. When told about these statements, none of which he remembered in waking life, he was at first astonished and distressed because these claims conflicted with his religious background, and he was a very devout man. He considered dropping the practice, but then he lost his voice again. A reading about his situation gave the information that if he was no longer willing to be a channel for the purpose of healing, that his mission in life was over. Finally, Cayce was persuaded to continue, with the provision that future efforts be centered mainly around healing. The remedies that were recommended often were extremely unconventional, involving the uses of ultraviolet light, diet, gemstones, higher thought, and relaxation in the sand at the beach. He attracted people from all walks of life and all strata of society to come and ask for readings. In his lifetime, Cayce's clients included a number of very famous people, such as Woodrow Wilson, Thomas Edison, Irving Berlin, and George Gershwin. His remedies were coming under the scrutiny of the American Medical Association in the early 20s, and Cayce felt that it was time then to legitimize the operation with the aid of licensed medical practitioners. So in 1925, Cayce reported while in a trance that he had been instructed to move to an oceanfront location at Virginia Beach. He was informed that the sand's crystals would have curative properties, to promote rapid healing. Backed by a wealthy financier, Cayce and his followers opened a hospital in Virginia Beach, but even though his advice gained the businessman a great deal of money, they could not ward off the effects of the stock market crash of late 1929, and when the money ran out, the hospital was closed. The Depression years saw Cayce turn more and more to spiritual teachings. After a few years, Edgar Cayce's friends and family asked him how they too could become psychic like him. Out of this seemingly simple question came an 11-year discourse that led to the creation of his study groups. From his altered state, Cayce relayed to the group that the purpose of life is not to become psychic for its own sake, but to become a more spiritually aware, attuned, and loving person. They were told that they could bring light to a waiting world, and that these lessons would still be studied 100 years into the future, a prediction that even now is becoming true. The readings were now about dreams, synchronicities, developing one's natural intuition, karma, the Akashic records, astrology, past life relationships, soulmates, and other esoteric subjects, in addition to healing. Hundreds of books have been published about these readings. It was during the middle years of World War II that Cayce became even more famous. But with fame came problems. Investigators started hounding him, trying to find scandals that he was connected to, and inventing them when they could find nothing. He defended himself, his family, and his associates as best he could, always trying to remain focused on a higher code of conduct, and continued with his work. Many American soldiers and their families were in terrible need of his services, and so he stepped up the frequency of his reading sessions in spite of warnings about his health and well-beings. But he pushed himself relentlessly, focusing on the need of others rather than acting upon the advice to moderate and limit his activities. He was repeatedly warned in readings that his efforts to stem the ever-increasing tide of requests would wear him out and eventually kill him, but he refused to stop or even slow down. Finally, in September 1944, he suffered a stroke. He lingered on until early January of 1945, and then his worn-out body finally gave up. He was survived by his Association for Research and Enlightenment, a non-profit organization which he founded, and by his wife and 3 sons. Though Cayce himself lived before the emergence of the New Age movement, some consider him to be the true founder and a principal source of its most characteristic beliefs. He is also considered by many to be the father of holistic medicine and the mind-body-spirit approach to healthcare. It was stated in one of his readings that humankind was in a crucial stage of development, with a new vibratory signature entering the populace starting in 1930, and that this would completely change the nature of people for the better. It is apparent that many far-reaching changes have occurred between that time and this one. We can only hope that it is far-reaching enough and fast enough in manifestation to fulfill his hopeful vision of our peaceful and prosperous survival and future existence. And that concludes this edition of a Metaphysician's Journal. Blessed be.